One man, one mission, watch all Walt Disney movies. This is Death by Disney. Hello, welcome to the Death by Disney podcast. I'm your host. Today I'm going to give you a review of Pinocchio. But before I do that, I'm going to explain the rules of this mission. There's only 2 rules. I have to watch all movies that have ever been produced or released by Disney under their own name, but of course also controlled by Disney, so that includes Marvel, Pixar, Touchstone, etc., etc. The other rule is that I can watch these films in any order, but the podcast episodes must be chronological. So yeah, there we go. Are you ready? I'm ready. Let's go. Everyone probably knows the story of Pinocchio, but if you don't know, here is the official plot synopsis. Pinocchio, a marionette, must earn the right to become a real boy by proving to be truthful, brave, and selfless. He is assisted by Jimmy Cricket, his assigned conscience. The film stars Cliff Edwards, Dickie Jones, Christian Rubb, Walter Catlett, Charles Judels, Evelyn Venerable, and Frankie Darro. This is the time of the podcast when I try to give you some interesting trivia about the movie I've just watched. Now, this is going to make me sound a bit dumb, but I didn't realize that Pinocchio was actually based on a book until quite recently. So the book is called The Adventures of Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi, who was an Italian writer who was active in the 1840s, and the book version of Pinocchio and the movie version of Pinocchio are quite different. Generally, Pinocchio is much more of an unredeemable character in the story, and actually the author wanted him to die by suicide and hang himself on a tree because he was such a bad character, but it was a serialized story that he was telling in a newspaper. And I think his editor said something like, oh no, you can't do that. There has to be a happy ending. So there was a happy ending. Other differences between the book and the movie are that the sea monster in the book is not a whale, it's a shark. And in the movie, it's a big, long kind of part of the movie. But in the book, it's a very short thing. And in the original story, there is a cricket, like in this movie, but the cricket doesn't have a name because the cricket tries to help Pinocchio, and Pinocchio kills him with a hammer. In fact, there's lots of animals that talk in the story, and they try and help him, but they usually meet unfortunate ends. This is the only one who's straight up murdered by Pinocchio, but I think a bird wants to warn him and he's eaten by a cat. So that's the general tone of the original story. Walt Disney's story is a much different take on that, and I will tell you all about that in one moment. But one more interesting fact about Pinocchio is that when it was released, it didn't make any money. It was actually a box office flop, which was a bit surprising because they spent so much time on it and they were just coming off the heels of Snow White. Okay, that sound means it's time for my review. Pinocchio is Walt Disney's second feature film. It's much better than Snow White. Snow White is the first animated feature film, and I can imagine that people were amazed when they were watching something in color in the 1940s, but it's actually not that good. Pinocchio has great animation and even a little bit of humor, so I could actually imagine showing young children this film. However, there are things about the movie that are just bizarre. I'm not the first person to mention this, but it is quite strange that Geppetto longs to have a real son, and when his puppet comes to life, the very first thing he does is to send his new son to school. You would think that he would do more investigation as to how this happened, or give more training to Pinocchio in the real world. The other bizarre thing about the plot, and I think this is from the original story, is that Pinocchio has all of these misadventures, and his father goes looking for him. And I know Pinocchio is on an island, but why does Geppetto get eaten by a whale? And why did Geppetto take his cat and fish to go rescue Pinocchio? And why do both of them survive after being eaten by a whale? The only other drawback is that the animation of the people still looks a bit bizarre, but it's much better than in Snow White. So I wrote that review right after I watched Pinocchio again for this project, and that was in February, and it's now June, so you can tell how hard this project actually is. But I have to say that even though initially I didn't like the story of Pinocchio, once you watch a lot of bad animation, you can really recognize what a true work of art Pinocchio is. Just the details in the background, it's very Baroque. There's like classical kind of Baroque kind of, like the workshop that Geppetto works in. They're all of like these crazy clocks. And I didn't put this in the trivia, but I read an interesting fact about that is that the animators drew all of these clocks, and Walt Disney was like, oh, those clocks would never work. You have to get rid of them. Those are too crazy clocks. They actually built the clocks and showed that the clocks could work. And then Disney was like, okay, yeah, put them in there. They can work. That is an incredible amount of detail for something that goes by in like maybe 15 seconds. So if you're a fan of animation, watch this. If you're a fan of cinema, watch this movie. The plot is kind of crazy, but that's probably more because of the book. At least he doesn't murder the cricket. So I thought a good conclusion to my review of these Disney movies would be to actually look at what other people have thought about these films. And I think the best way to look at what real people think about them is to read IMBD reviews, because that website has been online for a long time. It's actually one of the oldest websites in the world. And I didn't want to look at critics' reviews because I think you kind of get jaded as a critic, and it's kind of your profession, so you look at movies a little bit differently than normal people. To be fair, I want to choose randomly a very good review, like a positive review, and randomly a very bad review. Interestingly enough, there's no 1-star reviews for Pinocchio. IMDb 1-star reviews of Pinocchio, which is a crazy feat because there's over 1,000 reviews of the film on that site. So I had to go with 2-star reviews. This is the one I chose. Strictly for Kids by Paul Klassen24 from December of 2018. It's one thing to have a wooden puppet suddenly become alive, but another entirely for Geppetto to expect him to go to school and actually learn something. Well, I do agree with that. And he decided this just hours after Pinocchio became alive. He then sends the poor puppet off to school alone. This type of mentality belongs in cartoons where nothing has to make sense, not in feature films. It proves this is exclusively aimed at a very young demographic who wouldn't bother questioning these silly actions. I don't remember the classic story of Pinocchio being this stupid. Nothing makes sense. And what's with kids smoking cigars and drinking beer? Why would they show this in a film aimed at kids? Okay, so I hated this film. I hated every silly minute of this film. The film redeemed itself during the thrilling, action-packed climax, but only a little bit. I still hated this film. Okay, that was brutally honest. And yeah, I really agree with some of the criticisms there. I would say about the drinking and the smoking. Obviously, it's there because those are things that bad kids do, and the bad kids definitely are punished, so it kind of makes sense why they would do that. Alright, here is the positive review. This is from DD5 from July 2nd, 2004. Sweet and funny Disney classic. Pinocchio benefits from one of the finest collections of songs to grace a Disney cartoon. From I Got No Strings to An Actor's Life for Me, and best of all, When You Wish Upon a Star. A brilliant song sung by Ukulele Ike Edwards as Jiminy Cricket. This cute adaptation from Carlo Caroli's classic novel adds pets with the awe factor, cat and fish, as well as a truly scary sequence involving donkeys. The characters are all memorable, and Pinocchio is convincing in his move from a wooden puppet to a real boy, even in cartoon form. Good voice acting from Evelyn Venable as the Blue Fairy too, especially in the bits where Pinocchio can't help revealing he isn't telling the truth. Short, sweet, funny, and involving, Pinocchio is worth an hour of anybody's time, young or old. Okay, I agree with most parts of that review, except for the fact that it's not an hour, it's like an hour and a half. It's a normal movie length. So don't be deceived by that. I'm not sure why the cat and fish are there, honestly. They don't need to be there, even if they're an awe factor. And about the songs in movies, Disney movies, especially early ones, I just tolerate them. Although I have to say, the music in this movie is by far better, much, much better than in Snow White. So that's my review of Pinocchio. Please subscribe to this podcast if you haven't done so already, and leave a review. Every little bit helps, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.